The traditional date for this feast day would have been the 2nd of July, and in Germany they have actually retained that date. They've also retained that date in Siena, where I was ordained, for the celebration of the Marian Palio race, as on the 16th of August after the Assumption, and as on the 8th of September if there's a third Palio. The Palio is the most dangerous horse race in the world, as you probably know. It's very dangerous. They ride bareback and they just clear everything in the middle of the city to go round and round this area, and usually there are some casualties. That's just to say how old this devotion is to Our Blessed Lady, and as it happens, it's also the context in which Our Lady intervened in Siena. One day, it was actually around Corpus Christi, if I remember rightly, we were in the streets of Montalcino, our local town, which is also a walled city, carrying the Blessed Sacrament. However, the hosts in the ciborium were not just recent, but they were from 1730, perfectly preserved. And that was our miracle. It was at the time of the Palio in 1730 that the robbers had broken into a church and got into the tabernacle and made away with all they found. However, they must have had some kind of remorse of conscience, because they were only interested in the precious metal. And so in another church, they deposited the consecrated hosts in a money box for the poor. The whole city was in uproar because of the deep faith of that city, which is the city of Our Lady, and the Archbishop ordered prayer and fasting, and also that the Palio should not take place. So it was a big drama. It happened precisely when the whole city was orientated towards the big event of the year. And heaven answered, and miraculously they were found in this poor box. What did they do? There was dust on them, so they were not consumed. So they were put aside, expecting them to disintegrate. They're still there to this day. And one day John Paul II was there in front of them, and all he could say under emotion was, "C'è la presenza, c'è la presenza." The presence is there. The presence is there. He could feel it. About that time, I was on the ground in that cathedral in Siena, and that same power was going over my head. In fact, it was quite unexpected, because I thought that at ordination things didn't actually happen except on the level of the invisible and the ontological. But actually, at the moment, there is a moment at which I passed from being a deacon to a priest in that cathedral. Just at the point at which it happens, it's during one sentence, which starts, "Dona Padre Onnipotente" in Italian, "Give Father Almighty." The consecratory prayer is what they call the form of the sacrament, what makes it happen, because the laying on of hands is the matter. So when the form is complete, at that point one passes evermore from deacon to priest, irreversibly. And at that point, unexpectedly, I had my eyes closed, but I almost sensed this, and it was not just my imagination, it was something stronger. It was, for a fraction of a second, I just saw somehow that my soul was being taken out, put into the heart of the Blessed Trinity, and brought back again. I almost, as it were, sensed a shiver coming down at one point. It was as though I was being singed. And then, of course, one gets up and one receives then the indication that it has happened. But that's only, if you like, the trimmings, wearing the new vestments and so on, and the oil. Later that day, in true Italian style, just as we were coming out of the cathedral, the prior, our prior, went up to the Archbishop and said, he's got to go to Ireland, that was for the first masses, could you have the faculties? And just as a good Italian Archbishop, he said yes immediately, even though that could have been a lot of red tape. And so it happened immediately. And getting back to the monastery, my next door neighbour, Frère Dominique, who had been ordained not long before, turned to me and whispered in my ear, I think in French, could you hear my confession? And so that was it, before Our Lady actually, in the Abbey after Compline. First confession the first day. And I think actually the same happened before. After he was ordained, I think I had his first absolution. And so on it goes, because no priest marries, but it's handed on each time to someone from a married family. The priesthood carries on even though the priests die. And it's impossible to know which way things will go at ordination, what way one's ministry will go. Indeed, all one can say is fiat. It's carte blanche, one just opens all. It's a blank cheque. The Lord himself has to fill it. And all kinds of unexpected things happened. Because our prior was big into retreat ministry and spent a lot of his time giving retreats in monasteries, usually in France, because he couldn't take them all on board, very quickly he started giving them to me, those he couldn't take. So that was quite out of the blue. And there one gets involved with high voltage. One is handling some of the most fervent monasteries in the world, because France is a very monastic country. And one of the ones we were involved in was probably the strictest female monastery in the Western world, the Victims of the Sacred Heart. They have not changed a thing since they were founded in the 1800s. They still have the old rite, double grill, no heating at all. When I was there, still no electricity downstairs. It was just pure penance, and made to be so. No heating at all, at all, at all, and you could see your breath as you celebrated. And it was extremely austere, their rule. When you were preaching to them, you couldn't see them. Eventually, this double grill would open between one part of the building and the other, and you wouldn't see them. You'd see heads covered in black veils, without seeing the faces, and so on. And yet they've got vocations. They still write to me asking for prayers for the profession of so-and-so. The Lord is sending them vocations. They are extremely serious. So this was the kind of thing that we had to prepare for, and it was interesting, because one is going there to not just a bit of bonhomie, but actually genuine, intense, sacrificial victimhood. It's serious stuff. And also to the males. You are going to this great circuit of very powerful abbeys, which were actually founding other abbeys. And it was extremely moving to see how the glory of God was honoured. They spared nothing. They had liturgies which were very, very moving. And again, they drew. Again, no heating. Extremely austere, and yet they were getting vocations. Now, what actually I noticed was this. It's that whereas when it came to looking around and seeing how other congregations had bent over backwards to make the religious life enticing, it actually was not necessarily the case. The young people were going to where there was a charism, an identity, and a challenge. It was worth going all the way rather than just halfway. And so that was actually the case. I noticed also this, that when one was in a place like this, things were seen in a different light. Whereas when one is sort of going in and out of prayer mode, one is not actually able to get fully into the depths of prayer. When one is immersed for 8 days at a time in an atmosphere of pure verticality, gratuitousness and gazing upwards and inwards, one saw things in a different light. Now that actually also impinges on all the rest. Because if one makes a transposition to what, for instance, usually now over the Western world many people take as an encounter with heaven, what is it? In many a situation it's sort of an encounter with heaven, but it's contaminated. It's contaminated by the encroachment of the human. One thing that all these places had in common was that the human did not exist. One disappeared. If one goes into a celebration over the Catholic world right now, there has come in an element of communication of the person that is actually leading the others into prayer. It's not the same as the mystagogue leading into a cloud above themselves, when a person actually is looking at them, and also in the second part of the Mass itself, I don't mean the part we're at now, the first part, but the second part, still engaging with them. I mean looking at them even after the offertory, performing unto them, and worse still, mingling the human with the divine, e.g. in fabricating, in somehow making better than what he has received. At that point, several things are going wrong, because actually it's a misunderstanding of the nature of worship itself. God, in our Catholic setting, has given us the language with which he wants to be worshipped when it comes to the sacred liturgy. We're not in command. Now, do you see what I'm saying? If we come into this element after the end of the liturgy of the word, of going also into that mode of somehow being interesting, innovative, and performing, then we're actually withdrawing the blessings of God to some extent. We're not receiving all that he wants to give us because he has his hands bound. He is not free to bless disobedience, and it's happening massively. Also, there's another element coming in linked with it. That mentality of pleasing men, pleasing human beings, is coming into the whole liturgy in every area. And it's quite grave when actually, bit by bit, the notion has become not that of the vertical, but that largely of the horizontal, even in that second part. And it's just the tip of the iceberg when, for instance, after a good celebration, in inverted commas, what do we hear? A round of massive applause. That actually is very displeasing to the angels who are also worshipping with us. What's happening? It's meaning that we have actually hijacked the place of God and made of the divine a human event in which we've had a good time, but we've not thought actually about the will of the one that we're honouring. And that is not worship. Why? Worship essentially is the creature handing over his will. And if we're not doing that in the act of worship, following our own will, doing better than what the church wants, then we've got another thing coming. And the fruits are to be seen. Do we actually fill our churches with all these performances? Look around the Catholic world and look at those churches that are actually attracting. They're not the ones you might think. But scratch a bit and you will find that usually there's a lot of prayer happening there. People actually sometimes are willing to travel to find a prayerful celebration. Look around, it happens more than you think. And they come back. Now, I want to conclude, because this is specifically Marian, but these encounters on Marian feasts are very pleasing to heaven when we do it as our Blessed Lady wants. I just want to make one point. There is a problem in our Marian devotion in Ireland, and it's this. Although it's massively there, it's still contaminated by what we have received. I mean speed. It's a pity, because the rosary is still very much prayed, and it could be prayed well, but we have received a baggage which we're not able actually to adjust. It's just too big. The rhythm is what we're used to. So it means in practice that a high proportion of our rosaries are said, but probably not that much prayed. How can they be if we're going at a speed which is actually rude to the one that we're speaking to? And when that person is our Blessed Lady, it's very sad. Why waste the precious time of prayer in a flatus vocis, a breath of air, which is not prayer-filled? One day in Rome, I was wandering towards the Trappist monastery, of which Don Jacques, our friend, was abbot. He was a Frenchman who wasn't a monk. He was a monk, he wasn't a priest, and the community asked that he should be made abbot. So the Vatican had a quick whip round, and he got all dispensations and was ordained straight, one after the other, deacon, priest, and made abbot. And he's still there as abbot in this very old monastery in the heart of Rome. Well, actually, it's in the Eure area. It's just outside the heart of Rome. But opposite is something interesting. It's where Bruno Cornacchioli was there with his children while he was preparing a conference against the Catholic Church and also preparing to assassinate the Pope. He had his dagger, written on it, Morte al Papa, death to the Pope. The ball went missing. He was there at Tre Fontane waiting for the shop to open after the siesta to buy chocolate for his children from the Trappists. And he was preparing his notes there for this conference. And the ball went missing and the children went to look for it. But then one of the children went missing, so they went looking for him. He was stuck. All he could say was, Bella donna, bella donna, beautiful lady, beautiful lady. Then the other two children were also caught and they saw it. He couldn't understand. He tried to move them, but they were stuck and too heavy to move. Eventually, he too saw. And he then also heard. And he told him certain things, including the fact that the Catholic Church was the true church. And that was quite explicit. She also talked about her assumption, which at that time had not yet been defined. He was to go to a certain priest who would eventually make it possible for him to be sorted out and actually to go to visit the Pope. He was, sometime later, in the presence of Pius XII with his dagger. At the end of the encounter of prayer with Pius XII, a general invitation was given, because it was only a small group. Would anyone like to say something to the Holy Father? And he got up and went to him and presented to him the dagger with Morte al Papa written on it, and explained the story, begging his forgiveness, which Pius XII gave willingly. And he was not entirely surprised, because he'd been given an intuition a previous year that something of that nature was going to happen. It was fairly soon after that that the dogma of the Assumption was made a part of our faith formally. I return to what happened in that grotto, which by now is a sanctuary. Our Lady appeared with a book, obviously indicating that the truth was not just a question of opening the Bible and being one's own pontiff. But I think also that in the conversation which they had, which he was able to remember word for word, and it was quite long, she also unpacked the faith for him and gave him a very clear understanding of certain issues. And one thing one can be sure of, it's that what she wanted by appearing there with a book in her hand and declaring herself the Lady of the Revelation, la Rivelazione, was that she did not want to entirely brush aside all that the Protestants had with regard to prayer and study of the Bible, but to indicate that we had it also. And it was not exactly a question of superiority and either or, but of humility, of recognizing that the truth is the truth. But if we have it, we have to be sincere with it, and that's not always the case. Indeed, there are elements in which our separated brethren are justified in criticizing certain practices, and this one precisely is one which I think we ought to listen to. We scandalize our brethren when we say the rosary or any other prayer in a way which is obviously an insult. Why do we disobey when our Lord himself actually gave us clearly to understand that we must not think we are being heard for our much speaking? In the Sermon on the Mount he was quite clear, and he gave us the model of prayer. He also explained that we were not to look for attention, to go into our secret room where our Father saw in secret. Otherwise we became like the Pharisees, loving to be seen, performing. So, sincerity, hiddenness, and love. I just finished with this, because on the Feast of the Visitation, these two holy cousins said or sang these two canticles. We saw it from Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich in her visions. She was given to see them praying these prayers not once but regularly. And it's come down the centuries. The Magnificat is said all over the Christian world, even actually by the Anglicans at evensong, and it's there in all the Christian world at every sunset. We repeat these words, and also we echo the prophecy that she made, all generations will call me blessed. It's a beautiful end to the day, but be careful, because even this can be rattled off. I just conclude what I started. These beautiful centres of sincerity over the world do attract. Little Anna Mika, who one day came down and served here, she's right now for 3 months in one of these places actually, where they have adoration 24/7 in Holland, completely enclosed. But there, these do attract. Why? Because God is the centre of attention, and sincerity is there. And these holy nuns in that convent every day are also lying on the floor, physically, before the Blessed Sacrament as victims. They draw, and the Lord is free to bless what is under his obedience and what is sincere and what comes from the heart and is aimed vertically and not horizontally in the house of God.
And you see that rose bush there hanging there? That's a lovely one there.
Which one?
One up at where the car is.
Oh, where the car is. Oh, yeah.
That would be lovely rose.
Does it smell?
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah, really. Because there's not many of the roses smell these days.